here at Classical Liberalism, we like to run the trains on time. So we are, everybody here, hi Alex, everybody here, and our many fans online. I'd like to welcome David Neumark to tell us about minimum wages. A few of you still are not on mute. That means Dave Henderson and Michael Roster. Thank you. But definitely unmute yourself when you want to ask a question. Either raise your hand and jump in, and let's go.
Good, thanks very much. So thanks for the invitation. I don't know how many people on Zoom, I can't see you, but just cut in, I think is the best thing to keep things moving. I don't know exactly what the seminar is. They asked a couple of questions. There's economists I know, obviously. There's others I know, obviously. So rather than present a paper, I thought this was going to be an educational opportunity. And I've been working on minimum wages, I hate to say this, for over 30 years, which I did not think I would be doing when I started. My first graduate labor lecture, Jim Meadows came in and said, sort of, what a PhDs in labor economics. He said, one thing you should not do is work on the minimum wage because we know everything about it, which is kind of amazing in retrospect. But anyways, so I'm going to sort of give an overview of a lot of research. I'm not going to dive really deeply into anything, but feel free to ask questions. I'm going to try to get through a lot, but I'll be sensitive to the time and try to adjust on the fly depending on how much discussion there is. So let me just start by giving you some of the facts about kind of what's been going on in the minimum wage context. And this is all about the US. So the federal minimum wage last rose in 2009, a while ago at this point, to $7.25. That is still the minimum wage at the federal level, but we have moved increasingly to a system of state minimum wages, which many economists might say is sensible if they're higher in higher wage places, which to a large extent they are. There are now, I last counted about a month ago, it's changes quickly, about 30 states with higher minimum wages, ranging from, I believe the highest state is Washington, 1628, DC is 1750. A number of cities, some San Francisco a long time ago, but others kind of in the late 2000 teens have gotten into this business as well. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, this is in 2024, the percentage difference between, for all the states in DC that have minimum wages, between them and the federal. And you can see, and I'll show you some comparisons later, we now have low state minimum wages that are much higher than the federal, quite a few states over 100% higher. When this first got started, by this I mean enough state variation to start using state level data to study minimum wages, which gave us a lot more leverage over the question. There were 25-cent increases and 30-cent increases and 50-cent increases. So this is kind of remarkable, at least in a historical sense. Yeah, I don't know, it's good policy. It's definitely great for researchers. And we'll talk about, of course, the policy. So let me just give you a little context about what I think is driving the push for higher minimum wages. And that is going to lead into, okay, on what criteria should we be thinking about whether they're succeeding or failing, and could be different on different dimensions. So first of all, there's rising earnings inequality. We know this is debated, and I want to show you a couple key facts. It's gone up. Exactly where and why is important. So these are just earnings ratios. The blue line is the 50th percentile or the median to the 20th percentile, so kind of middle to the bottom. Weird stuff goes on in the Great Recession, but this was the nice graph in other ways, so you can kind of ignore that. But it's rising steadily. Big increases over kind of the 70s and 80s, which got this really big inequality work going. But one thing to note, of course, is a lot of this is happening at the high end too, right? And the 90 pulling away from the 50th, and I'm going to show you even more, the 99.9 pulling away from everybody else. Minimum wages aren't anything about that, right? If we think that's a problem, different opinions, but the minimum wage is not a solution for that, not even relevant to it. Yeah.
This is earnings, not wages.
Yes, I'm going to show you the next slide. So this is interesting. That was earnings, of course. So annual earnings. This is actually quite interesting. So if you look at this graph, this is this is what's happening kind of in the middle, 45th to 55th percentile of earnings. And you might say not a lot. This is what's happening at the bottom, and what you can see here is a lot of this. I mean, wages have come down sort of relative to the middle by comparison to that graph. But a lot of this is work, weeks work, right? Which of course is some of it's non-work and some of it is intermittent work. And again, this is where John was
Yeah.
going, minimum wage doesn't really address
And
that.
you're missing government support,
I'm missing what?
government support. So as wheat works go down,
Yes.
unemployment insurance goes in and everything else, I wouldn't be surprised if that was pretty flat. If you took all,
With government benefits, too.
yes,
Oh, sure, yeah, no, but this is about, right, but I think a lot of the debate here, and I'm gonna come back to this much later, is. You know, some people say it's fine if benefits fills in for any.
No, I'm saying-
inequality, and some people say no, that we want the labor market
I'm
to do
saying it's
this.
causal.
Oh, could be causal. But you know, I think, there's an element of that. I think there's a longer literature which kind of started with the whole rise in inequality in the seventies, which has pointed out that low-skilled people, and in particular low-skilled men, are working less and less and less relative to everyone else. And some of that probably is, now it is a more selected group because there's fewer low-skilled men because education levels are rising. But some of that is just driven by, I mean, you know, wages have fallen at the bottom in real terms. So some of it is probably a pure labor supply incentive just from wages. Policy, it's not really that awkward, generous to those people, except around the Great Recession, COVID, or
I mean,
episodic things.
It's not what you're gonna talk about today, but obviously everything caused by that.
Sure.
It changes your incentive to invest in
Sure,
education.
absolutely,
changes
absolutely.
everything.
Yeah, John.
So I was just reading a Michael Strain piece on China, saying that average or median wages, that which one have risen 40 to 50% of its. You're getting average wages or median wages, because the middle.
I mean, there's a lot of people argue about what the deflator is, and it's not something.
Was that about the deflation?
Yeah, as best I can tell, when people say real wage, you know, there's been no average wage growth for 30, 40 years, I think Strain's pretty convincing that's wrong. I don't think he would dispute what's happened at the bottom. You know, there's a lot of things that get missed here, right? The whole, what about all the CPI stuff? What about all the new products we have?
So the debate is it's not so much about the wage data, it's about how you deflate it. And I think.
How you inflate it and-
they're not working.
Yeah, and what we don't measure well, like Bruce Meyer has this very interesting work that says, you know, yes, you can look at earnings and they've fallen in real terms, but then you look at the houses people live in at different points of the distribution, and the kind of houses lower income, not very high, but lower income people live in now are the kind of houses middle-class people lived in the 1970s. So the quality of a lot of things has gone up a lot, and we may not measure it that well.
And this
but-
doesn't include like health insurance and other benefits, right?
Right, this is-
One story I've heard
This is what the labor market is.
wages are static, but we all just took it in the terms of more health insurance, maybe do or don't want.
Well, or it's maybe cost a lot more than it should.
Or maybe-
right?
exactly.
Yeah, no, the value of benefit.
I feel we're getting
Right,
value
right,
for it,
right.
that's where the ones,
Yeah,
okay,
that's-
thank you.
That's right. And then this is, again, something about which there's a lot of arguments. This is from Piketty et al. Disputed to some extent, but you know, not broad brush strokes. That at the top, there's been a real pulling away, and we don't have to get into that debate, but the point is, that is probably the biggest focus of people talking about the rise in inequality. And obviously, minimum wages has nothing to do with rectifying this problem, if you think it's a problem. Just want to lay that as context. The other thing I think that drives this debate, and I think when you read what advocates for minimum wages say, at least want to be clear, is they say, oh, this is going to reduce poverty, poor families, terrible thing. We should do something about that. And you could say, the US poverty record is a little discouraging. Right? GDP per capita has, gone up over time with blips. And the poverty rate, we've had some dips. We had, when the economy does really well, the late Clinton years, the early, the pre-COVID Trump years, poverty has fallen when the labor market gets really hot. But it's kind of been flat for a long time.
Poverty is
What's
like top bottom 5%. I mean,
Poverty, so the US use it, it's more discouraging because we use an absolute standard. Like we have this weird history from the 1960s where they were trying to figure out consumption bundle that achieved some acceptable level, and they took the food budget and tripled it. That's actually our poverty line, and we still roughly do that. There's alternative measures and all that, but and then there's but the official, the sort of standard long-running census poverty measure, you might say, especially since we use an absolute standard, kind of should have been falling as income went up.
Meyer and Corinth have
Right.
this stuff where they say it's actually only 1.9% now, but is that because of government programs?
Right, so I have that caveat on
Okay.
my notes slide, right? So Bruce Meyer's done this great work. I have to say, I don't know if you probably had him out here. He first, a long time ago, started getting all this administrative data stuff, and we were all like, Bruce, what are you doing? It seemed like a nightmare. But 20 years later, it's kind of amazing, and there's a lot to talk about. But the core result is that his government benefits do count in the income that they use to calculate poverty. And his core result is that reporting of everything in the CERT, like the CPS, the ACS, we actually measure poverty from the annual CPS file, annual CPS survey. Reporting has gotten worse and worse and worse. It's gotten relatively worse for low income people, and the reporting of benefits has gotten relatively worse. So he's got all this administrative data, like what is program X paying out, and he goes through all these incredible negotiations, kind of stuff you guys are doing in your center, to link to social security records, whatever, and they can actually fill in what people are actually getting and finds that, yeah, I mean, it was kind of amazing. I think it was first or second Trump economic report president. They put out this report. I think he was involved. I'm not sure.
Kevin Corinth was
Hmm?
involved. Like, Kevin.
Maybe that's right.
Corinth was
And what it said was,
I was not in the first, not in the second report.
what it said was, this is
All
digression,
people were-
but that's fine. But what it said was, actually our anti-poverty programs have been really successful, right? They've really, when you count the money the right way. And strangely enough, the left attacked that instead of saying, great,
Yeah, great.
that's what we're trying to do. It was a very weird debate. But anyways,
This include child poverty or just?
this is an individual. Family doesn't look that different. I mean, it always looks a little worse for children, partly because low-income families have more kids, and partly because the poverty line adjusts.
Okay, but it is an important debate, because if the actual poverty rate is only 1.9%, then maybe we don't need, minimum wages to, or
Right.
minimum wage is gonna be addressing like a tiny sliver of 1.9.
No, that's right, that's right, that's a fair point. I'm gonna argue it doesn't reduce poverty anyway, so you can even measure this way, but I agree with you. I didn't,
I should welcome you to the classical liberalism seminar, where you can anticipate a different sort of questions than you're used to.
Not a problem. So far we got that. Okay, so I think these are these are in the policy debate, the key arguments. A higher minimum wage will help low wage workers. A higher minimum wage will reduce poverty. And now I want to turn to, what we learned about that. So I actually have a couple of cartoons. There aren't many minimum wage cartoons. We raise minimum wage to $1 million an hour, everyone will be Bill Gates, which some people don't seem too far from that position. Anyway, so what does economic theory tell us? Very quickly, for the non-economist, something becomes more expensive. In general, we use less of it. Think of what's happened, gasoline
Not
prices.
having to convince this group of.
Don't forget this group. Okay, fine.
Well, there might
Good
be.
Fair enough. That's standard. When in labor, it's a little more complicated. Labor is a derived demand. No one hires, I buy stuff to make me happy. I don't hire workers to make me happy. I hire workers to make stuff that I sell to other people to make them happy. So we say it's a derived demand. But the basic story is minimum wage pushes up the price of the lowest skilled workers. Firms reduce the use of those workers. They try to find other either higher skilled workers, think of the checkouts at restaurants, capital, higher skilled workers. There's a study from the Seattle minimum wage where they have like a grading system for help, for cleanliness of restaurants. They let the restaurants get a little dirtier. I mean, there's a lot of margins of substitution, right? All those things, maybe except the last one, raise production costs because you were minimizing costs originally. Prices go up if consumers are sensitive, they demand less. And then you have what's called the scale effect, which is lowers labor demand. And both of those effects for low wage workers, the substitution effect and the scale effect point in the same direction. Higher skilled workers might do better, right? Because you might have a shift in demand towards them. But low skilled workers sort of get hammered kind of on both margins in theory. There's exceptions. Sometimes minimum wage might be non-binding, in which case, of course, this won't matter. The big thing that's dominated a lot of labor economics research, and I mean, it's been around a long time, but it's come to the fore lately, is in models where there's labor market power or frictions, it's possible that a higher minimum wage increases employment. The idea is if a minimum wage induces a lot more people to look for jobs, firms might find it more profitable to open up a job, to sort of try to fill a position. It's a good story. There's really not much evidence for it. I'm trying to do some direct research now with job postings data, the kind of stuff that you can get from all these, large websites you can have straight. Anyways, that's a model some people take seriously. And what it says to me is you need to look at the evidence. I'm not a theory guy. I'm an evidence guy. Somebody once said to me, "Why are you wasting your time? We know the minimum wage reduces employment." I said, "Well, I'm convinced by evidence, less than models, more than models."
So Jeff Clemens' work,
Yeah.
into different kind of substitution. Which low skilled workers get the job? The one who needs a flexible schedule, or the
Right.
one who could say, I'm there, whenever you want me.
Right.
The one who needs extra benefits, the one who needs free parking versus the one who doesn't, the one who might not speak English so well versus the one, so it's
Right.
really not so much a total low skill effect, but a transfer to which kinds of workers get the jobs. Unfortunately, the ones who need them, you know, the least skilled get the least jobs.
That's right, that's right. And the other implication, what he does is there's, you know, you're sort of reducing the choice set of jobs in some sense. So, you know, there's a welfare reducing thing. And he's got some other work on, sort of some simpler work on minimum wage effects. That's also true. I mean, another dimension that comes up is, you know, I have some work which looks at the minimum wage and the earned income tax credit in combination, which I'll touch on later. And the sort of, you were just who needs a job, but you might also come at this from the perspective of who's it more efficient to have a job, right? And it's still true that a lot of policy, especially earned income tax credit, focuses on increasing work incentives for single mothers. Now, that's good. I mean, it increases income for families. That means kids are going with more resources. But in some sense, whose time is valuable outside the labor market? Single mothers. Whose time is worthless outside the labor market? Teenagers, right? But some of the policy choices we make are kind of in the other direction, which is an interesting question that hasn't been really studied in a lot of detail. Okay, so what does the evidence say? So now this is the debate I've been mired in for a long time, and I'm going to walk you through some of it.
If you want to put together the two things you said, I mean, in fact, minimum wage workers, there is a reserve army of the out of the labor force here, because
Right.
there's these only 30% of the lowest quintile are working at all.
Right, that's right. Yeah, and you know, right, so when I say, I should qualify, when I say, you know, if teenagers' time isn't worth that much, if they're already out of school, if they should be working, then they are foregoing capital investment. That's a big.
What's the opportunity cost of time for someone who would take a minimum wage job? And just what I'm learning from you is, of course, there's teenagers who could, you know, just as well be sitting at home playing video games, or there's whatever that huge number of, you know, private men who aren't working are doing all day long. Is,
Right. No, right, and
there's an elasticity there that ought to be pretty strong. Okay, thank you.
Right. That's right. We're a lot of that problem is in the lower wage, poorer states, the less skilled men, and that's probably a different question. Okay, so what does the evidence say? So this is where we were when my first graduate labor professor said, don't do any more, we know everything about this. There had been this Department of Labor study. It was, for those of you who are old enough, which is a lot of people in the room, and not everyone, you know, the New York City phone books. It was a 5-volume set. It was about as thick as the New York City phone book. Every labor economist about 10 years to 20 years older than me has a paper in it. They were mostly time series studies because that's what we had at the time. And they sort of summarize things in terms of this elasticity, which I'll come back and talk about later. But this was the elasticity of employment of young workers, teenagers, 16 to 24-year-olds, you know, a group that would be affected a lot. So the minimum wage, and there's a sort of consensus that was up -0.1 to -0.2. So 10% increase in the minimum wage reduces their employment. Again, for strongly affected groups, this is not about aggregate employment, but for strongly affected groups by 1 to 2%. That's kind of where we were way back then. The problem is it's hard.
This isn't, you know, a supply or demand elasticity, it's some sort of combination of the two, right?
It's even weirder because it's an elasticity, and I'll talk about it later, with respect to just a policy parameter, which is how much the minimum wage changed. But even when the minimum wage changes, the wage, you know, even if you are a minimum wage worker, your wage is going to go up by less than that increase typically, because we, you know, at least in the US, we do this periodically. I told you we haven't reached the federal minimum wage since 2009. So it's kind of a weird elasticity on both dimensions. So time series data are, you know, when we can do better, are problematic. There's a problem of the counterfactual, what would have happened otherwise. When we have time series data, the only way to get that is out of a statistical model. This problem comes up a lot. You say, what was the effect of the fiscal stimulus? You know, COVID, Great Recession. We don't have an observation on the US economy where that didn't happen. So in that case, we can only do it through a model, statistical or theoretical or some combination. But once state and now city minimum wages started to become prevalent, we got a lot more leverage over this. Because now I could think about a state that's like another state where the minimum wage didn't go up that I can compare to the state where it did go up. That's the sort of the gist of the panel.
The government programs in the two states might not be the same.
Oh, absolutely. And there's been an explosion of research the last few years about how this method can, I think, greatly overstated, can sometimes go awry. But it's this is the compelling and intuitive research design. I think it often works. It's great for policymakers because you can explain it to them. But it's it gives us a lot more leverage. And the US has become this great which is why there's so much research on minimum wages in the US, this great laboratory. In most European countries, you have a single minimum wage. It's also often negotiated with unions and businesses, so it's really endogenous. But the US, we have quoted, I don't think it's random, but this much more plausibly exogenous variation, and we have a lot of it, especially lately. So this is a number of states I mentioned before, we're at 30, 31, I'm counting BC here. That's exploded. This was kind of when this research literature first took off. We had a burst of states. The late 70s, we had inflation, and we had not changed the federal minimum wage for a while. So a bunch of states sort of jumped into the game, stopped, and then it's really taken off. And again, by sort of percent difference, I showed you the last point, you can see that's gotten pretty pronounced too. So what does that evidence say? So that's sometimes called the new minimum wage research. Washer was the guy at the Fed I started working with. I started the board a long time ago. We've stuck with this for maybe longer than we should. Anyways, we did an extensive review. This was done in the sort of 2007-8. We took all these US studies using state level data, somewhere over 100, 2/3 find negative effects. Subjectively, we said which are the more credible ones based on, criteria we try to lay out. People can disagree. Larger effects when the studies focused on the least skilled, which is kind of what the neoclassical model predicts. And we kind of said the consensus is right. We didn't really get a real different, which isn't that exciting, but a real different answer. Although there were some very prominent studies at this time saying, isolated ones, but nonetheless prominent, saying there was no impact on minimum wage unemployment. And then there was, when Wash and I, we were editing that book, I remember, we were sitting around the board, and somebody walked in and said, "What are you guys doing?" And we said, "We're editing this book, and then we're done with minimum wage research." And he said, "You sound like something alcoholics say." This is my last one. And we had to be done. And then we got this explosion of research driven by largely a center based around Michael Reich at Berkeley, Aaron Dubé now at UMass Amherst. They've really jumped in. And they have raised some good points. I don't want to say, but certainly challenged the results, shall we say. Michael Reich, I remember reading when I was in grad school, he was one of the real radical economists. And now it's become more of, at least in terms of data, more of what the rest of us do. My friends at Berkeley, and I have a couple, the Jewish ones say, "You've done a real mitzvah because you've revived his career." Anyways, so the main issue they focus on is the potential problem that, in this paradigm of using state variation, you're treating the variation as if it's exogenous. It's like the random assignment of treatment in old, Fisher statistics. But this is policy. That maybe that's the truth. But, and there's a lot here, but they basically, to read this all, there's sort of a summary. This is an often cited paper, Dubé, Lester, and Wright. I talked about this paper at Hoover a couple of years ago. They said there's no detectable employment losses from the kind of minimum wage increases we've seen in the US. It's sort of their bottom line. But their basic point, and I'll take a second, is that minimum wages don't occur randomly. And what has to be the case if you believe that sort of the other results are biased towards finding job loss, but the truth is that there isn't any, is that minimum wages are adopted where low skilled labor markets are sort of declining. And it's actually an odd story to tell, because my interpretation was always politicians kind of like minimum wages. They're popular with the public. Even Republicans favor minimum wage increases. But they also kind of at least the Republicans and maybe moderate Democrats realize that there may be some trade-offs here, right? So if we're going to raise them to make voters happy, let's do it when times are good, and then maybe they won't notice.
I have a question. David Henderson here.
Yes.
Shouldn't studies be biased to finding negative minimum wage effects? After all, we have economic theory. And so our prior ought to be that there's a negative employment effect. And so I think I'm not saying you are, but Dubé and so on are throwing out the whole idea of economic theory.
So why, the original question is they should be biased. When you say biased, do you mean, I thought you were going to say, and therefore editors publish things consistent with our priors. That's not what you meant when you said biased?
No, I'm saying that, I'm a Bayesian. And so I have this view that an increase in minimum wage will cause a reduction in employment. And so something has to be somewhat strong to go against that, is what I'm saying. We shouldn't go into this you know, as if we're that guy who moved from Stanford to Harvard, Raj, where he just does data and doesn't really do economics.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think this is an area where, this is not like so complicated. The more complicated theory gets, the more ambiguous the predictions are, perhaps. This is pretty basic theory, right?
Right.
And I think that's doesn't mean it's right. That doesn't mean we shouldn't entertain evidence inconsistent with it. But I do think there's been let's go back to Carden-Kruger. So Carden-Kruger wrote this famous paper published in '94, where they do fast food in New Jersey and kind of eastern Pennsylvania, so near the border. And they find it's often described as, it's often described as we don't find any job loss. They actually find massive job gains. They don't really say that, but they find this positive elasticity of like 0.8, 0.7, 0.8. And I was there when they presented that work, and people were skeptical. And instead of saying, we think this is a clever design, we get this result, we should be skeptical. We beat the hell out of it in the data. We can't make it go away. What do you think? That would have been fine. Instead, they write a book based on that paper called Myth and Measure, right? Which is basically your point, that all of economics must be wrong based on this one paper. And this one paper is based on a single minimum wage increase in 2 states.
Right.
And that is I hope I have learned from that when I have a surprising result, and I'm going to show you a surprising result later. Be really careful.
Well,
until we vet it a lot.
They do.
Hmm?
You don't have a Nobel Prize and they do.
That's true.
Despite that result not holding up.
That is true. Right.
After people look hard at it.
Right. No, that is true. That is
So
true.
you're failing in the marketing department.
That may well be. Yeah, there is a high return in economics, maybe in other fields, I don't know, to staking out a position and sticking with it, and which is inimical to science.
I think there's some positions that are easier to get better off.
Well, that may be true.
So, Mike, what did DLR do that contrasts their findings with the other 100 studies you found?
Right, I'm going to explain that in a minute.
Okay, did they use it? Okay.
Yeah.
I just, one quick question. So like, there's tons of research back for this employment effects. I'm curious, like, and maybe this is in your slides later, but I'm curious what you think about the much smaller literature pioneered by people like Tom Curdy here that argue that the impact is more through prices, and that there's basically what happens is minimum wage is passed through prices, and that contributes to
There is a slide on that too.
Okay.
I don't know if he says it's more of that. I think he says it's an important channel we've ignored.
Right.
Kind of the way I read it. But yeah, I will definitely come back
Yeah,
to that.
because I mean, the reason it's not absurd to look at this kind of thing in the light of sort of standard economic theory is that, demand, the demand curve for labor could in theory be very inelastic.
Right, I mean, there's martial laws, right?
Pass increases along as it works.
Right, we care about the man.
Consumers are-
Right, so
Yeah,
and I'm gonna talk very much, when I come back to the second question about might this reduce poverty,
Yeah.
the magnitudes are critical, right? If it's not zero, even, could be, you have a small negative impact, but it still could be good for a lot of goals you're trying to pursue.
Sorry, go on, say,
Sure.
is the story that they raised minimum wages in states where employment was going, low skill employment
I
was
mean,
going down?
that would have to be the source of
Is that
negative
the story?
bias, yes, yes.
And why in the world would they do that?
They've been doing this for a long time, and that has never been stated clearly. And in fact, I remember when I first read that paper, I said, yeah, I think they're gonna find, I expected, they have this design, which we'll talk about in a second. I thought you'd find a more negative impact if you control for this sort of, if you can, endogenous, like where does the minimum wage go up and when, I kind of thought you'd get more
It's
negative.
an obvious story, it's higher in states with higher price levels.
Right, but that's all,
Like,
but all the level stuff is netted out in all these studies, right? It's all diff and diff.
Oh my God.
Kind of things, right?
Can I
Yeah.
ask you a question about the diff in diff? It's Paola Sapienza, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So we have learned, past Carden-Kruger and so on, that in order to run this diff in diff, you need to have some balance test, which goes to the point of, is it really a good comparison? So do people
Yes.
rigorously do these in recent years? And do they pass the standard Imbens balance test on diff and diff? Because, that's basically the employment, independently of the endogeneity. The question is, will the employment trend be different?
Yeah. I would say, I mean, It's a critical question. It's somewhat technical. It varies from paper to paper. I'm gonna touch on this a little bit, but I think the problem with this paper, even though these papers, even though they're trying to address exactly your problem, they're saying there's sort of, employment is trending down beforehand, then you get the spurious negative effect. I think that's actually not what's going on, and it goes the other way. But that's sort of a study to study question you definitely have to ask. Okay. So what are these papers? What are these guys doing differently? They're basically saying you got to do a cross-border design. So saying, look, let's take small areas on opposite sides of state borders, and they use these, call them county pairs, even though counties don't always line up, but close enough, right? So you've got a pair of counties that straddle a border. The statement of wage goes up on one side and not the other in some cases, and we can assume, and all we do is assume, that whatever shocks are correlated in wages or trends or whatever are the same on both sides of the border. That's the underlying assumption. So we call that a close controls approach, and it's been done in other areas. And it is true. This slide, don't worry about the details. I'll just tell you the impression. These are the studies I'm aware of that use this.
Okay, it's a dumb question, but I can't believe the thing. I mean, obviously competition means if you look at two places very close together and you move costs in one and you don't move costs in the other one.
Right, but that should make the estimate more negative, right? You might think that, but it doesn't. So the question is why. So most of these close control studies find nothing. The first one is the June Western Right paper. That I sort of talk about the most. There's this one exception, and I'm not going to get into all this in this talk because it's sort of way into the details. But I will say this, that they are using cross-border areas that are actually more likely to be integrated economies, and I think that's the problem here. But this is their argument, that you have to look at these cross-border areas. The unmeasured stuff is the same. The Paulo's question, the pre-trends, whatever it is, and lo and behold, you do that and you get nothing. Now that's it's a fair question, right? I have criticism of the method, which I wasn't aware of until recently. But it's a reasonable question to ask, and we do ask about policy variation and where it comes from. I will say the following though. And in some sense, this is where I give them credit. Like this got people thinking about, don't just blindly throw the statement of wage on the right-hand side and assume all the variation is fine. So there's a bunch of other papers dealing with the same problem, but in different ways, not the close control. So Thompson does low wage and high wage counties in the same state. And the idea is if the other stuff that might be going on in the background is at least at the state level, we should net that out. Clemens and Wither, different paper you were talking about, John, they look at minimum wage workers relative to those who are just above the minimum wage, but who aren't affected, right? Because then you're getting, whatever labor market shocks are happening pre-trends ought to be the same for those two groups. So it's to close controls, and I guess in the wage distribution, not in geography. The Sky and Rubenstein, it annoys me that this paper isn't published yet, but for those who know Yona, he usually takes at least 15 years to publish a paper. I think this is a great paper. They basically use the federally induced variation as an instrument. Remember, the federal government can raise the minimum wage. States can't go below it, but they can of course go above it. So they sort of say, let's look at the states. If we want to get rid of this state endogenous policy thing, let's kind of isolate the variation that comes from the states that tend to let the federal minimum wage buy more than, let's say, California or Washington or Oregon, and use that induced variation. Because presumably when the federal minimum wage goes up in Mississippi, that wasn't Mississippi policymakers choosing, where and when to raise the minimum. And then there's some other things. All of these actually find negative effects. So they're addressing the same problem that Dubé and folks are addressing, which is that we don't want to just treat minimum wage variation as exogenous necessarily, but all these other approaches still yield sort of conventional negative effects.
David, can I ask you a question? I'm sorry, I have
Yes.
some connection problems. This is Elena Pastorino. I wanted to go back to some of the previous comments about what theory predicts. We do know that in monopsonistic models of the labor market, pure monopsony or monopsonistic competitive labor markets, or there is an incarnation of search and matching models, to the extent that firms do have wage setting power, a minimum wage can be beneficial. But I think the challenge to Dubé and others is that the degree of monopsony power that could possibly justify the negative employment effect the positive effect that they find is completely counterfactual. But I don't think Chad Syverson has, I think, a recent working paper pointing out what's the effective degree of monopsony power in U.S. input markets. I don't think this point has reached through the labor economics literature that is supportive of minimum wage type of interventions. So what is your sense, David? of where they are?
I agree with what you're saying. I have to say, so probably the most prominent paper that says, let's try to measure monopsony power, which, as you know, is very hard to do, but let's use some sort of, it's the Azar, Marinescu, a bunch of other people. They're using one of the job posting companies, which now changed. It's now called Lightcast, whatever it's called before. Glassdoor, not Glassdoor, not Glassdoor. Anyway, Burning Glass. That's right. And they sort of are looking at the kind of the share of ads from a company, of all ads in an area that come from one company to measure monopsony power. And they kind of run a model, employment on minimum wage, and they interact it with that measure. And they say, oh, look, the interaction is positive, meaning when there's more monopsony power, the minimum wage effect is less negative. Which is sort of, as I say, Lena, kind of consistent with these models. I asked Yada many times, okay, so what is, what sort of if you weight by population in areas and apply the right elasticity based on this market power measure, what do you get? Like, does it ever really become non-negative? And they've never done it. I have some work very much in progress where we do that. And to your point about there isn't enough friction for this to matter, for almost the entire distribution of we're doing counties or commuting zones, you're in the range of negative employment effects. So even if you believe this model, you need to go to some areas where there's really very few employers.
David, could you spell out the name so I can check that study?
Can I what?
Spell out the name of the author or authors so I can check that study.
The first one is easy, is AZAR. That's the first author.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of others. It's published in or coming out in Review of Economic Studies, I think.
Thanks.
Okay.
I was just reading about some famous Chicago economists, which one would always grade down any student paper that didn't say quantity or time on the x-axis. Long run.
I just read that. Did you just have a tweet on that? I just ran into that somewhere recently. Okay.
But that brings up, I mean, these are effects that obviously like rent control. It takes a decade to put in the automation and get rid of workers and so on. The diff and diff does, what was lovely about cross-state design is you're looking sort of at permanent effects. A diff and diff is usually, there's a difference in time. Of course, next month you didn't fire all the kids.
Right.
But so to what extent are we looking at longer?
I mean, there's some attention paid to that. I mean, this, where you let the treatment evolve over time. And I read it, there's not a lot, but so Mir and West have this, Jonathan Mir and I can't remember West's first name, have a really nice paper where they talk about, and this pertains to all the new diff and diff literature. I think they do it in a more intuitive way. But they say, suppose the minimum wage kind of changes the growth rate of employment. Now, I mean, that's not entirely clear why that happens, but some of the minimum wage increases in some states have also introduced indexation, right? So then you might actually get a shift in the growth rate of employment. And they point out exactly what you're saying, that you can really get misleading answers when you do short diff and diffs, or when you do diff and diffs with a standard linear trends for each state. You can just get very misleading answers. And the dynamics, I mean, and then there's a paper by the guy.
Elasticity mechanisms take time.
Right, and Sorkin has these. Isaac Sorkin, he was a student here. He's a professor. I don't forget where was he a student? Can't remember. Anyways, he's got some nice theory work with complemented by some evidence that really gets into this question of, as does Eric French and others at the Chicago, who's not Chicago Fed anymore, where they talk about this issue that, like you take a plug and play model, right? The existing estab, not much changes, but either you're replacing the capital or new estabs are coming around. I mean, an analogy I talk about to report a lot about this topic, so I have these like nice stories, when I used to go to McDonald's when I was a kid and you ordered a medium soda, someone had to keep their finger on the button, right, the whole till it was filled. And then of course, eventually they switched to 3 buttons, right? So they could hit medium and go grab the fries, whatever. And wages keep up. And now the soda's so cheap, they just give you a cup and you can refill it 12 times and they don't care, it's just not working. So, but these things do roll out. That's a simple technology. They do roll out slowly, I agree.
Some of the differences in results within this line could be just driven by certain authors being able to drill down to exactly who's treated, like right? And that could also explain why some other studies out there don't do such a good job of drilling down to who's treated. I think only 1.7% of people are actually working at minimum wage. Is that true?
Well, so the Department of Labor puts out numbers based on the federal minimum wage, which is increased, which is not that
add
easy.
state in, and Yeah, I remember
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about before, at Stadium, maybe it's 2.5 or 3%, but I mean, it's,
I mean, for, you know,
yeah.
yeah, it varies a lot. I mean, you know, if you
Okay.
take the California minimum wage and go to the Central Valley, I haven't done it recently, but I did that about 5 or 6 years ago. It was
Yeah.
like 30-40%, but you know,
But
so
then
it
drill-
varies.
Then you can.
No, I agree. That's up to
The
you guys.
question is, how do you apply these types of elasticities to policy decisions? Because
Yeah.
somebody could say, well, yeah, that's right, if you look at the people who are directly affected, then this is gonna matter, this might matter a lot, but we're doing this and it's a relatively small number of people who are directly affected.
Right, that's right. And what that means is that elasticity is very misleading. What you
Right.
really care about ultimately is what we call the own wage elasticity of employment, right? For the people whose wage, I mean, so I have a slide in this later, but we can go out of order, it doesn't matter. So when I said this, these elasticity is, let's say, minus 0.2, and I kind of come down, and that's, remember, that's a low skilled group's employment with respect to the policy change. That number is too low for 2 reasons. One is what you're talking about. Even if I take teenagers or high school dropouts under 30, or take your pick, right? A lot of them aren't affected by the minimum wage. So the other thing I really care about is what's the job loss for the people who benefit from the minimum wage, right? What's that trade-off? And for that own wage elasticity, -1 is sort of the critical value, right? If it's bigger than more negative than -1, then income actually falls when the minimum wage goes up. If it's close to 0, even if it's negative, back to your point about magnitudes, it doesn't. So one thing you could say is you can Clemens and Wither, who are focusing explicitly on low wage workers affected by the minimum. None of these other papers are, and they're pretty damn close to -1s. You could also just do back of the envelope calculation, saying, let me look at teens, what share at the minimum? It's maybe a third, so that's gonna, that's gonna reduce the denominator in that elasticity, blowing it up. And then you could also say, yeah, but when the minimum wage goes up by 20%, wages of low wage affected workers go up by 10%, let's say, because a lot of between the old and the new reduces the denominator more. And in a book, we have a section where we discuss that this elasticity can easily be in the -1 range. Not at all surprising, and I'll show you some results. Maybe.
Well, you only have 20 minutes at most.
What happens to 20? I thought I had 40, I thought I had 45 minutes. You're not gonna tell me.
And do we quit?
Normally.
They told me 90 minutes. They told me 90.
Oh.
Okay. I'm not in charge.
Good. Well, I got only 2 minutes early. So.
Normally we go to the other day.
Oh, okay. Well, let's, well,
Oh, okay. Is
yeah, I
that-
still want to ask a question.
Okay.
You can't.
What are we going to?
No, what
Well,
they told you is what we do.
How about
Okay, good, good.
economists? We normally 11:30 and then questions. So
Well,
let's
okay.
have economist rule, since we've already
Yes,
completely
yes,
broached
exactly.
the economist
Which is
rules
fine, right.
issue. And we'll go to what, 11:45?
Okay. So I may skip some questions then. Did you have a question?
I'll make it short, and you can decide not to answer. How's
Okay.
that for a deal?
Okay.
There's the usual problem with diff and diff, is that we're looking at these tiny variations, one is 50 cents more than another across the state border. But the correlations are enormous, so the real minimum wage in Fresno is way higher than the real minimum wage in Palo Alto, because the price of everything is so high. And the level of variation across states is just enormous.
Now.
So if those elasticities were big, you would expect to just be screaming in the data from you that there are some, let's see, that all the low skill employment is in Palo Alto, which doesn't seem to be the way it works, but.
Right. Yeah, and it's a question of whether I mean, you mentioned earlier, right? The non-employment among the low skilled, the non-employment among Black teenagers is really high. Is it screaming at us or not? I don't know. Maybe it is.
Well, I guess there's also, why is that not true? Because it's incredibly expensive to live in Palo Alto.
Well, there's that, yeah.
No, so you should see the unemployment in Palo Alto, not in the Central Valley. Because the Central Valley is high wage.
So the real minimum wage is much
It's
lower
much
in
higher.
Palo
Yeah,
Alto than it is
right,
in
yeah,
Fresno.
right.
But
Yeah, so
The other
I'm buying, you're right.
there's a
I'm
labor
not-
supply, okay.
Let me-
labor supply is like-
Let me shift gears. Let me shift gears a little bit. So
Do you say-
okay, so the other question, so I just should, I think. The close controls give you one answer, other things give you another answer, I'll come back to that later. I have a paper where I ask a broader question, it's a really simple question, but we did this because I had a very good grad student who now sort of runs the equivalent of the CBO for West Virginia. Who wanted to go back to West Virginia, and he came to me one day, he said, David, what are all the recent papers on the minimum wage actually said? What's the answer? And I said, I don't know, I write some of them, I review a lot of them, whatever. So I said, let's do this, not a meta-analysis. I don't like meta-analyses because they just count all the estimates, whether it's sensible or not. Let's actually survey everyone who's written one of these state minimum wage papers since '92 and ask them what the preferred estimate of the paper is. You know, what it's for, teenager or some industry, whatever it is. So we did this survey, we got a very high response rate, we coded ourselves to what we thought, just to see if we kind of got the same answer, very tight correspondence. It's sort of, you know, I said, I don't know, we're gonna publish this paper because it's kind of a weird paper. But what's odd is when he asked me the question, I went digging and I said, economists don't even summarize the literature the same way. It's one thing to say this paper's better, this approach is more convincing. But here's 3 quotes. From Krugman, there's no evidence that raising the wage costs jobs. Carden Kruger, the 20th anniversary edition, whatever their book, the literature after myth and measurement was about equally likely to find positive negative employment effects. Lew et al., there's considerable support for the competitive market hypothesis that an effective minimum wage would result in lower employment. This is people describing the exact same literature. And maybe this happens in other areas, but I don't think so. There's a lot of ideology in minimum wage literature, so maybe, or space in general, maybe that's why. But I thought it was useful to do this survey. So I showed my wife this figure and she said, that is really cool. So what is this figure? This is, you can't read this, these are authors and years. These are all the studies, right? And these are the elasticities from the papers. This is 0, that's positive, that's negative. They're darker, the more significant. I mean, this is not adjudicating. This is like a very different approach. Don't adjudicate studies, don't critique this. These are all published papers, right? It's pretty clear, right? You know, if you want to say the literature doesn't show job loss, you got to ignore most of it. Now, maybe you want to make that argument, this is all wrong, you know, Dubé and company would say that, but clearly in terms of the representative studies, that's what's going on. There are some, I mean, these positives are very hard to understand. This
That's
is
Carbon Kruger in the bottom and Clemens.
second from the bottom.
Second.
This is Katz and Kruger.
Yes.
We didn't promise anonymity in the survey, so I will tell you, Larry said, I don't believe that paper anymore. So anyways, and a lot of these are, anyways, I like this picture.
Yes, whether their results shifted their priors and by how much.
Right, no, that's one. One can't answer and the other won't respond to my email.
You could estimate, you could weight by the impact of the journal where it's published.
And to the point earlier about biases, Carden Kruger, AR, there's Dubé, well, Dubé's right, RE Stat, it's a pretty good journal. Dubé is another paper, huge, if anything, despite whoever said that about
Okay.
biases,
Well,
I think the quote unquote surprising papers have published better than the unsurprising papers.
Oh, and cited, this would be fun to line up against.
It would be done, it would, yeah, that would not be hard, actually. We also did this against time, you know, they say, oh, well, now we know better how to estimate the wage effects. They're not negative anymore, the correlation is literally 0.0001 or something, there's no, I showed you the pattern by time, completely random, yes.
It's like, it's worth thinking about, you know, the elasticity isn't gonna be constant across wages, right? Like,
Say it again?
the elasticity isn't necessarily going to be constant,
Oh, sure,
right?
right, yeah, to Josh's point, these are not all the same groups of workers. We divide this up by low skilled industries, less educated. In general, the effects are bigger when the studies, I focus on a group that you think should be lower skilled.
If I can.
Was that, sorry, I think I cut off. Was that your question? Or-
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, I would just think about this in a few different ways, you know, like you're raising the minimum wage from, you know, $5, $5 to $6 is totally different from raising it from 19 to 20, right?
Well, there are elasticities, but I still think that's,
But I'm saying, you know, the elasticity shouldn't necessarily be the same.
I think that's right. I think when people talk about, I have a slide, which I won't get to on, people talk about a $15 federal minimum, that used to be what they talk about now, what Bernie Sanders is talking about now, but you know, that elasticity has to get, if you think it's non-zero, you know, when the minimum wage, if it's 1.7, Josh, or 2 or 5%, you know, you raise the minimum wage, there's a lot of margins of substitution. You impose a $15 minimum in Alabama, you know, how much can you let the bathrooms get dirty or make the portions smaller, find a high skilled worker and put in an electronic checkout? I mean, if it's 30% of the workforce, it's gotta fall in labor. And that's, I think, a real concern. And I think, frankly, even some of the minimum wage advocates share that concern about doing a uniformly high minimum wage.
But if I can put my Chicago hat on for a moment, we're not estimating a structural parameter, it's not a supply curve, it's not a demand curve, it's not a preference, not a technology.
Right.
It's some shift in the general equilibrium where social program benefits and phase outs matter and the cost of living matters, and then when the prices goes up, that feeds back on everything else. So
Right.
No wonder it's different across all sorts.
Well, that's true. I have one paper where I tried to do it structurally with sort of an old school switching regression models. You know, but that itself requires assumptions. But yeah, it's just not the norm in this literature, although people do it.
I'm not understanding this picture, I realize. How do you order the papers?
Ordered?
The top to the bottom?
Oh, yeah, these are ranked by the size. The authors reported back one elasticity, or sometimes a couple. And we said, what are your most reliable estimates you believe from this paper? That's the estimates we've rank ordered.
And there's a comment from the chat from Art Carton. I live in Alabama. You'd be surprised how dirty the bathrooms are.
How much dirtier? Yeah.
I was wondering if they have, or anybody has been looking at the effects in a household. So I know that there were recently some polls in which they asked young people if they actually want to work or not. And I think it was a significant amount of young women said they would prefer to just stay at home and raise kids, and they feel that they don't have an opportunity to do that. So could part of the change in the change in employment be a choice of, look, we just need enough money to live here, to live the life that we want. So as long as one of the two of us
Yeah.
has a higher wage.
So,
Yes.
in principle, that can happen. That's a good question. I've never actually seen anyone get at it directly, but it could happen. Yes. Take one question, then move on.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
really, part of my study is, besides like publication bias, you have. It would be really cool to line up these studies by their, and just to see like to what degree, like, how we measure.
There are a few.
Clustering is around 5-6%.
There are a few studies of publication bias in the minimum wage literature. It's another discussion, but you know, the AR paper, I'm forgetting the authors, the guy who won the MacArthur at Harvard, the econometrician.
Andrews.
Hmm?
Isaiah Andrews.
Yeah, they do minimum wages and two other policies and find little, for what it's worth, with respect to minimum wage. I can't remember what the other two policies are. That's where they find publication bias. I've done a little work on that. I have some qualms with that literature, but let me push on. So okay, so this is the last slide, I think the last slide on employment effects. The results of employment are contested. I think most of the studies, a greater variety of studies, point to adverse effects. And when we say, this is a quote from the survey paper, concluding that the research evidence as a whole fails to find disemployment effects of minimum wages requires discarding or ignoring most of the evidence on those skilled workers. Now, you might want to do that. We have this paper coming out, I think this is the day of Hoover a couple of years ago, in JP Micro, where we take a close look at that paper. I don't want to get into it here, but this relates to, I think, Paula's question about pre-trends. And we actually argue, I think we have pretty good evidence that they have a bias towards finding no effects. And I just will tell you one funny story. I'm not going to directly impugn anyone's intention, but I think it's informative about the minimum wage debate. So they use these cross-border county pairs, right? We use cross-border commuting zones. Right, commuting zones are defined basically so that most people commute within them and not across them, right? So they are sort of integrated economies. We just sort of thought, you know, this makes more sense. Like why are cross-border counties similar economies? When you do that, the negative effects persist, nothing changes. We have some stories about why, but there's also a paper by two of the three same authors, unpublished in 2009, exactly when DLR was being written, where they say, we should really use commuting zones and not cross-border counties, and they do that in analysis of teen data. So it strikes me as surprising that there's no mention of that in this other paper, because you presumably would have been easy to do with the exact same data set. So I don't know, you know, what exactly is going on here, but there may be some, call it confirmation bias.
I'm still chewing over the basic question here.
Yeah.
It's always phrased as what's the demand for labor. We talked about substitution and demand for labor.
Right.
But it's really about the supply of labor. Suppose you live in a world where unless you work, you starve. So labor supply elasticities, whatever it is, well, they're changing the minimum wage is just gonna raise or low, you know, they're gonna work no matter what.
Right.
Whereas, you know, to be able to permanently lower employment, the people who aren't working gotta be eating somehow. So
Right.
there has to be some other you know, maybe they're in school or they're teenagers at home. So
Well, there's a lot more safety net than
the
there used to
thing
be.
you're estimating is not about, it's as much about the slope of a supply curve as a demand curve.
No, that's a fair point and I'm going to show you some evidence. It's not motivating the way you're motivating it, but it pertains to the same issue about how things looked in much earlier years when there was much less of a safety net. And if you didn't work, you did starve. We're not gonna ask any different employment necessities. That's actually a really good question, which we could do, because you can go back. You know, simpler analyses, you can go back through the censuses, at least back to 1940.
Now, I'm starting to feel left wingy. I mean, this depends about which group you're looking at.
Happens.
You're looking at teenagers taking summer jobs, you know, middle-class teenagers taking summer jobs. There is, you know, they can do something else.
Right.
If you are looking at find your biggest bleeding heart, you know, somebody who no social program, has to work or starves, then that, you know, that is a fair bit of elastic supply, and that's there you actually might do some good. These
Right.
elasticities are gonna differ very.
But then the
much.
demand's gonna matter more.
Even with the same technology on the demand side.
Right.
McDonald's, the effect is gonna be very different among different groups of supplied labor based on what.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's right, yeah, I agree. So let me, I'm gonna show you something related to that, but I hadn't. The idea of looking at different employment effects in that context is quite interesting, actually. Okay, so this we talked about how the elasticity is overstated. I'm gonna skip these slides, and it could be close to -1. Just another cartoon. Doesn't minimum wage help low wage workers. I got a raise, my boss fired me to pay for the raise. I don't like these cartoons. Okay, so I think what my research, you know, I'm convinced that minimum wages cost some jobs, right? Now, this is, I don't know when this came out, you know, the Chamber of Commerce always writes its top 20 job killers thing, and this is sort of, you know, the sky is falling. You know, they just see, the business community just says the minimum wages go up, there's some job loss, must be a bad idea. Well, remember, and this gets back to what I said before, and what Josh said before about magnitudes, you know, there might be some reason we do this, right? Every regulation costs somebody a job somewhere. That doesn't mean every regulation is a bad idea. We got to think about costs and benefits. So how do you evaluate the minimum wage relative to that? I mean, I don't know. I like this quote from Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy, you know, perennial introducer of minimum wage increases in the Senate, usually right before an election. Minimum wage, this is his autobiography, one of the first and still one of the best anti-poverty programs we have. I do think that, at least I used to think, now they've changed gears, but you know, that if you could convince a minimum wage advocate that the minimum wage didn't reduce poverty, you might convince them we should think about other policies. You know, that may have been optimistic. So let me show you some data, and this gets to your point, John. So here's, this seems like a no-brainer. So what am I doing here? I'm defining a low-wage worker as someone who earns less than half of the average private sector wage. And then I'm putting them in income needs categories. That is your family income. This is not, so now I'm switching to families, because that's how we think about poverty. Your family income relative to the poverty line. So if the income needs ratio is 1, you're at the poverty line. So where are low-wage workers? 85% of them less than poor, very small percents more than poor. So that looks like maybe minimum wage does a lot of good, because some people make higher wages, right? And if the job loss isn't so big, great. The only problem is this is from 1939. You kind of screw it with. So, and look what happens if you look at other years as you take this out, right? Just watch that top line number, 85, 42, 20, 16, 13, goes up a little bit in the last decade. 3 or above, 0, and now 37%. So what that means is, first of all, what's going on here? A lot of things are changing. To John's point, in 1939, you had to work, right? There was very little safety net. It's also true that most workers were the men in their families. Women, married women were pushed out of the labor market. At that point, they were more. Many of them didn't work before World War II. There were teenage jobs. So low-wage workers were poor. As we expand the safety net, fewer and fewer people work, because they don't have to. And you can see there's a couple ways in the data. What's going on here? First of all, a lot of minimum wage workers are teenagers, right? They're not poor, right? In fact, jobs where poor teenagers live are not very plentiful. Jobs where white middle-class teenagers and Asian middle-class teenagers live are very plentiful because they're shopping malls and all kinds of stuff, right? Second, non-work. If you look at, you take the CPS, look at families, leave out people with, older, working age adults, leave out people over 60, over 65, whatever. Half of poor families have 0 workers. Like half of poor families with working age adults, little bit misnomer, but you know what I mean, have no work. Because minimum wage isn't going to do anything for them. And there's one more thing. What does this mean? There's a couple ways to interpret this. 3 times the poverty line is pretty close to median income. Depends exactly what family size you're talking about. So that means 37% of the gains What you're doing here is a static simulation, no behavioral response, I should have said. Say, let me look at the wage distribution and look at the income distribution. Let me just raise wages, right? Assume no response, different people at different parts of the income distribution get more money. How is that money distributed? Where does that go? So you believe that static simulation, 37% of the increase in the wage bill, right, is going to families, roughly speaking, with above median income. I mean, it's high, but it's nowhere near poor. 16% or so, 22% is going to, up to 1.25 times the poverty line. And what that means roughly is again, it's a back of the envelope calculation, but to get a dollar to a poor family by raising the minimum wage, you have to raise the wage bill by about $5, right? Every distributional policy has some dead weight loss. I'm not an expert on this literature, but I think you might say other policies that cost $1.30, $1.40 to get a dollar to a low-income family because of distortions. Here it's sort of $5, which is remarkably inefficient. And I will say, most scholars of minimum wage, we argue about employment effects, don't really dispute this. Except they argue.
The 5 just means that most of the money goes to teenage kids and middle class.
Well, that's what this is happening, right? The poor families don't have a lot of workers, a lot of it's going to teenagers, exactly.
David, I'm not defending it, but the $5 isn't like dead weight loss because it is going to someone, right?
Yeah, that's
No,
right.
I'm
That's
sorry.
important that
Wait a
somebody-
minute. I take it back because it's taken from someone. Forget it.
Well,
Forget
if
it.
somebody is paying it,
Yeah, forget
But you're right,
it.
it's transfer.
It's a
transfer.
But it creates distortion, but it also creates dead weight loss.
Their main goal is to transfer from capitalists to labor without.
Right. But there's also hard distortion, but there are distortions.
Yeah.
If you believe in job loss.
I agree.
Right, but even without dead weight loss.
So the reason why I think that the picture that you're painting might not be reflecting reality completely is the following 2 cases, which I think are generalized. My neighbors, the owner of the house is an engineer, his wife works at home, his kid who's older than me works there, lives there, he works in the grocery store, his wife used to work in the grocery store, and their kids also live there. It's a tiny house, you have 6 people living there, I think 7, one of the brothers also lives there. So I will say that this sounds like a poor family, and actually the secretary of my PhD program, she was telling me that her brother and her sister-in-law had to move to her parents' house because they couldn't afford to have a house. So if you're just measuring households, all of these cases in which people don't have enough money to have their own independent household with their nuclear family, all of these people will count, according to this, as rich people because now they're moving with their parents.
These are families, not households. These
Yeah,
are,
but so
CPS, you measure families.
how do you distinguish, how will you count?
So they ask, I mean, there's a roster of,
Yeah, so imagine there's a household in which you have.
there will be 2 families in a household.
So they will count them as 2, not a 3, even if one of the other brothers is living there.
I mean, I'm not sure how CPS captures every complication, but these are families, not households, so they
And the
will,
need scales.
they will, yeah, I mean, there's a scale for kids count a little less, older people count a little less, sorry. But families are distinguished.
Yeah, but that's the thing, like, it's not just you're not just looking at teenagers, you're also looking at some work.
There's definitely, this is all low wage workers, minimum wage, teenagers are roughly a quarter of minimum wage workers, 16 to 24-year-olds are roughly 50%. So, but that's part of, I think the only point is, that's a lot of the reason why a lot of the gains, if you look at who the low wage workers are, a lot of the people who earn minimum wages are in high income families. My favorite story, my daughter had a job in high school in San Francisco. She worked a little gymnastics school in the Sunset District. And this was 06, I think, when San Francisco raised its minimum wage. And she came home and said, "Oh, I'm so excited, I'm getting a raise," because San Francisco introduced the minimum wage. And I said, "No, I will bet you I make 3 times what the guy who runs that little gymnastics school makes," right? And she sort of got it, she said, "Well, I'm still excited."
There's another.
But that was her money, not my money.
So back to Jonathan's point, those 16 are also in the 100% marginal tax rate regime.
Well, it's
To
high.
give you a
Yeah,
dollar
it's high.
minimum wage, you lose $1 worth of other benefits. So in fact, there's no benefit to their actual.
Yeah, I mean, I know where you're coming from, it's high. The EITC, I don't know if those calculations really take into account the EITC, which is a really big subsidy, depending on what your family situation is. right?
Well, it depends how many programs are. You're typically
Yeah.
eligible for 150 programs. You signed up for 2 of them.
Right.
And do you?
But the EITC is a program which gives you
Yeah, it
gives you more money as your labor
Right,
income
but it
goes up.
offsets, it tries to
Right,
offset
right,
the disincentives.
Right.
But there is a drag. Your question is if I give money, how
Right.
much goes to poor
No,
people?
that's right. After tax, my guess is you're
There is
right.
an after tax and after benefit loss.
Right, I agree. This is just a cartoon that the op-ed stuck in, the Wall Street Journal stuck in an op-ed I wrote, which I thought was kind of appropriate about missing the target, with, there was a 10-10 minimum, you can't see it's blurry, sorry. There was a 10-10 minimum wage proposed under Obama, which didn't happen. Okay, real quickly, we've tried to finish up 10 minutes. The research on minimum wages and poverty pretty much shows no relationship, and which is very consistent with what I showed you. Same kind of analysis, not as many. There's one paper that's an exception by Aaron Dubé, but there's a lot of work and it kind of points to no significant impact. And I think what this suggests is, we talked before about transfers, and I have a paper that sort of looks at kind of the max CPS data, so you can see sort of gains and losses. And I think what you're seeing a lot of is money is moving around among different low-income families. Some people are better off. If your wage goes up, your hours don't fall much, you have your job, you're obviously better off, but those same costs are falling on others. I'm gonna skip this slide. I do want to show you this. Don't try to interpret this yet. So we asked, there's this question about who's paying for the minimum wage, right? And obviously business owners are at least first order paying it, and of course consumers, per McCurdy's point. I was in Israel on a sabbatical, and this guy from the Treasury Department walks in and starts telling about his paper, and it wasn't that interesting, whatever, doesn't matter. But I said, what kind of, like, what do you have? He said, well, we have this data set that matches all of the income tax records to workers. So in other words, I said, so I can see in this data set what the owner of the business earns, as well as what all the workers earn. And he said, yeah. And I said, great, because now you can actually kind of get at this incidence question. So we worked, took a long time to get together, but I just want to show you this one sort of fact. So what am I showing you here? This is the fraction of workers in a firm, whether the business owners own it or where workers work, that are paid the minimum wage. Okay. And these are the income percentiles of the business owners. So what this means is those numbers are higher up there for people who own firms with not many minimum wage workers, and they're lower in firms where you have a lot of minimum wage workers. This is the laundromat versus the high tech firm or whatever. So that's not that surprising. And then you look at workers, who are in firms where there's not a lot of minimum wage workers, so they're not generally not minimum wage workers. And their income percentiles are about the same. So these guys are paying for the minimum wage and they aren't. And these guys, can't reach that high, not at all, are making even more, and they're definitely not paying for the minimum wage, right? And we do a lot of other stuff in this paper, but it makes a simple point, which seems obvious maybe, but there was no evidence, that the incidence of minimum wage, that's the first order, is on lower income business owners. It's kind of exactly what I said to my daughter about the gymnastics school.
Can't go to that. I mean,
Hmm?
to say that the entire minimum wage is paid out of the pockets of the business owner.
Oh, no, I agree. I said first.
The business owner raises.
Absolutely, I said,
and half
right,
of businesses
prices go up.
Out of business, so the return to capital is the return to capital. In equilibrium, we expect business owners to bear zero and
Not
higher
zero.
prices.
Because they reduce the scale of their business.
Yeah,
So you have to
yeah.
think, but what I don't like about this literature is not approaching it from the zero NPV perspective. Zero NPV to high net worker. Right?
Mhm.
So if you raise costs, it becomes a negative NPV. Now he re-optimizes.
Yeah, what you get is a one-time wealth grab, it's like a capital tax, one-time wealth grab from the business owner, after we go out of business.
Right.
And then the return to capital is the same after that, just like a corporate tax.
Well,
right.
and if you act on a business, you
Agreed.
reduce the scale of the
Well,
business,
scale.
which changes the consumers.
Yeah, so there's a one-time wealth
Yeah,
shock to the business owner, and then after that.
Right, that's right. No, that's right. But yeah,
So
I
the only wedge in all of that is exactly what you said, it's monopsony. If it's positive NPV to hire the worker, meaning that's monopsony, then of course you can have an effect, but you better come up with a lot of reasons why, in a low skilled place, you have monopsony power, I mean, come on.
Right.
Well, they come up with lots of
Right,
reasons.
Right, and then this is the slide back to this McCurdy point. I already slide
David,
on
can
it,
I
but-
ask a question about the previous slide? Why did you have those numbers in yellow? I didn't quite get
Oh,
that.
I was trying to highlight the fact that the income of business owners who don't have many minimum wage workers, and therefore at least first order don't pay the higher minimum wage, they're higher income than the business owners of firms that use a lot of minimum wage workers.
Got it. Thanks.
And the latter, who, at least initially pay for it, are about the same point of income distribution as workers, as many workers in sort of the higher wage sectors. So who's paying, if we think
Got it.
about, if we want to if we think minimum wage is a good redistributional tool, you know, we're doing this through a tax system, like people in similar, whatever policy we agree on, people in similar circumstances should be treated differently. It should be treated similarly. And the minimum wage doesn't do that, right? Because of who employs these workers. That was the
Right.
point.
Thank you.
This is the McCurdy point. I won't put his paper up. But you know, his point was poor families consume a lot more stuff produced by minimum wage workers. You know, yachts are not produced by minimum wage workers. You know, Kentucky Fried Chicken is. I was once at a I like this slide because I was at an AEI thing a long time ago, and Kevin Murphy was talking, and he said, you know, I walked to do a KFC for lunch before I got here, and I couldn't tell on which side of the counter people were poor, right? Was his point. So, you know, that's a real issue. And there are price increases, and we, you know, there's the one industry where we have a lot of evidence is the restaurant industry. People have studied a lot, 0.15 maybe price elasticity with respect to the minimum wage, which is not trivial. Okay. I just want to touch on this one thing, because this I'm going to give a whole paper on this in Hoover in December, but this is the result that I find really surprising, and I'm trying to be very cautious about. You might be surprised that almost nobody has asked, are minimum wage effects worse for blacks than for whites? It's kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing.
I'm so surprised.
You should be. But it's true.
Because I know what we're gonna find, and that's why it's not.
Well, we quote this Milton Fried column from, I think, 1965, you know, using the word Negro, which, you know, the most anti-Negro policy we have. I don't know if it's the most anti-Negro policy, but anyways, you know, why might we expect it? Well, they have less skills in terms of observables, and probably also unobservables, lower quality schools, stuff we don't measure. And also, if there's discrimination and their productivity is undervalued, yet another reason why, you know, who's going to be let go or not hired. The wage, you know, the minimum wage is more binding for, this is all black versus white. It's also more binding if we could, not as much, but if we condition out, there's a high school or less. I'm just gonna show you the one slide, because I find this amazing. It's not a small difference, right? So what am I showing you here? These are a bunch of groups. You probably can't read it. I have like less than high school, less than 30, less than high school, and less than 30, teenagers, bunch of groups. I'm showing you the wage elasticity on this axis, right? With respect to minimum wage. And those are, roughly speaking, they're actually a little smaller for blacks in general. And the employment elasticity, and for whites, they're really bunched near zero. They're not just not as big. And for blacks, some of them are, you know, for those of you who can see, you know, -0.2, -0.3, -0.4. This kind of says that, just looking at these two groups, I haven't done Hispanics. I'm a little wary because of, you know, legal work, illegal work, all that kind of stuff. I think this is really clean. You know, to use crude language, this may make the shit hit the fan. This is kind of amazing, I think. It's really striking. We were here like in April, and I kept saying to my graduates, no, like do this. It doesn't go away. And it kind of says all the effect, essentially, among these two groups is falling on blacks. If you, I don't have the slide here. If you look at earnings, you find for whites some zeros, a couple positives for some of these subgroups. For blacks, for some of these groups, you find strong negative, or just earnings, including zeros, right? Negative effects on earnings, taking account of hours employment. And of course, you know, there's some wage gains.
Exactly what the substitution across different kinds of workers would say.
Yeah.
And I would bet if you did Hispanic recent immigrant doesn't speak English so well, you would find things even bigger than this.
Right, you might though have work off the books. That's why I'm a little,
Well, that's,
we might go there in a separate
no,
day.
that is, that's an alternative value.
Right. Yeah, but you know, I'm not saying, but we don't know what the, right, we might find less of an employment loss because we don't, in the data, we don't know which way they're working.
Also, Gunnar Myrdal,
Right.
Myrdal, in his book, An American Dilemma, laid out quite effectively how the minimum wage hurt black people.
Oh, that's again, I will check that. I wasn't aware of that source.
Yeah, and also Paul Samuelson in his textbook, 1971, and James Tobin in a piece in around mid-60s.
Great. All right, well, look, anyways, this is, we're just really trying to.
You gotta be careful, I'm gonna see this,
I'm not worried.
yeah, you'll see, you'll see. You'll be accused of sharing that in the data.
I'm sure, that's why we're being.
You'll be accused of every single, people will come
I know.
after you.
I know, but to John's point, like, is there evidence screaming at us? I have to say, I've been asked many times by a reporter when I say I think minimum wage would reduce employment. So should we not have a minimum wage? And I always say, you know, cautiously, well, that's outside the range of the data. I can't really speak to that. But I've sometimes said, but you know, I kind of wonder what employment would look like in inner cities. if there wasn't a minimum wage. And maybe this tells us something.
Just before you go and start saying minimum wage is the new Jim Crow, I just wanna know
I would put it that way.
whether, how big are the confidence intervals on these, so like these really tightly estimated things?
Yeah, these are, the solids are statistically significant, you probably can't tell from that,
Okay,
yeah, they're
but-
pretty tight. This is these are huge ACS samples.
Okay, but I mean, if you're really gonna, all right, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if you're really gonna make that claim.
No, we actually, I mean, we test the black, white, we do these interactive models and they're often significant. Yeah.
And have you control, so you have control for urban, rural, you have control for working in the same industries.
This is done at the Puma level, and we do it at the Puma level and the state level. We have all the Puma fixed effects. We have
Yeah.
Puma times black interactions. We're soaking up,
Everything.
trying to, yeah.
But is this the commuting zone research?
No, these are going back to much simpler employment. These are like old panel data models, but we're doing some of the new diff and diff stuff too, and it looks robust. If you just, I don't have it here. I could do I could take the period 2011 after, when you have states that have the federal, stuck at the federal the whole time, and other states that start raising their state minimum wages. So we do that kind of comparison. All this new diff and diff stuff doesn't matter, and you see it on the graph. I should have put that up as well. Anyways, okay. I talked about this. I want to stop. I'll just say a couple things. I can say then talk for 2 more minutes. Is it as hopeless as it seems? Changes in the economy have probably disadvantaged less skilled workers. How do we increase incomes without discouraging work? Big problem, obviously. I just want to say the EITC, for those of you who don't know what it is, it looks like this. The EITC, look at the top line, it's easiest to see. This is 24, gives you with 3 kids, a 45% subsidy to your earnings. You get, and most of you don't know federal check. So up till about 20,000, stays flat, phases out at a slower rate. This is the new welfare, right? Bob Moffett calls this the work-based safety net, right? If you don't work, we don't do much for you anymore. But if you work and your income's low, we do a lot for you. And that may be a pretty good policy. But the EITC, I won't even put up more slides. I'll just tell you what we know about it. It increases employment of low-skilled single mothers, which is kind of the group that gets the most out of it because you get more kids. And if you don't have 2 adults, of course, your income is lower. Clevin has a paper disputing that. He's the only one. I have a paper that shows you actually, it increases the extent to which you earn your way up. The effects are big enough that even without taking account the EITC check itself, more families' earnings go above the poverty line. And I have a paper with Pete Shirley, which says that these are much harder to tease out of the data, but you do these kind of long run effects. And you get sort of a human capital effect, where this encouraging work leads to, so women, these single mothers who were exposed to more generous EITCs, because we have state variation now, as they were sort of going through their 20s, are earning more in their 30s, right? So it's kind of, there's always things you can argue against it, but if you want to do redistribution, it looks like we have arrived somewhat accidentally, if you go back to the origins of the policy, at this policy that works really well. When people say, well, what are we going to do if inequality keeps getting worse and worse and worse? I don't know, maybe make it even steeper.
We still have only 30% of the lowest quintile working, so we got a ways to go.
No, that's right. Well, that's because people, you without kids, this is what you get without kids, essentially 0. And there are barriers to work in some places, and some are.
It's layered on top of a huge set of.
Exactly.
This, I think,
No.
is offsetting the massive.
Offsetting
No, and the 50-year-old guy living alone in Kentucky, this is irrelevant for. But I do think this is, comparing the two at least, it sort of hits all the right buttons instead of all the wrong buttons. It encourages employment, it encourages skill growth. It targets the poor well, by definition, it's based on family income. You don't have this problem of minimum wage workers can be poor or not poor. So in all those ways, I think it works a lot better. And of what has been proposed so far, I'm a big fan.
We should wrap up.
Yes,
Which I think
I
you
am.
just did.
I just think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That you can do it on your payroll.
You used to be, so you used to have the option of doing it like on your payroll. 2% of people did it that way. It was always this real puzzle. And then there's a woman, Jennifer Romich, who's a sociologist. She sat in, I don't know, it was E.F. Hutton, thanks, like E.F. Hutton or one of these people, they do like free tax prep for low-income people as part of their marketing. And just interviewed people as they were doing their research. And she said, you could have gotten this every month, or why don't you? And they said 2 things that made a lot of sense. One is, it's really hard for me to predict my end of year income. Like we can predict our end of year income. So if I'm off by a little, no big deal, but for them, they lose the job, you don't know. And they said, when you're poor, it's impossible to save for the, the $1,000 security deposit to change apartments, replace your car, new washer, right? This is like forced savings, and we want that $2,000, that's a lot more, check. At the, because when my kids are hungry, or I can't afford clothes, or my landlord's banging on my door, I can't save $100 a month, it's just like, that's not the world I live in. But, makes a lot of sense. So now you can't, they changed it, you can't even do that. And which is also, I think one of the ideas that it was maybe it was stigmatizing for your employer to know you were eligible, so now your employer.
Let me ask you,
just your taxes.
is there, there must be a lot of these low income people who never even file taxes.
Well, yeah, I mean, the ITC boosts filing, for sure.
By a lot.
By a lot.
But I mean, are there people who just don't know, who are oblivious, who are giving up income?
Probably.
Yeah, probably.
There are, but it is incredible, once when I was working at the University of Chicago, I thought it'd be a nice idea to take the green line from downtown to Hyde Park, but you shouldn't do that. I got off the
But you're
train.
still here.
Yeah, I'm still here. I got some interesting comments when I got off the train, but there were just a couple of businesses right there around 55th and Garfield. There's getting your checks cashed. There are a couple of dining establishments.
Past the ITC.
And then there's what is it called? Jackson, one of the major
I don't know.
Jackson, Hewitt, Jackson, whatever. I mean, and actually, I mean, in Chicago, you see these tax preparers have these little outlets everywhere. They're basically just trying to get people to file for the ITC.
Yes.
They'll do things like they'll advance them the ITC money.
It's like EITC rapid return, and it's the same, often the same as the check cashing places.
Right.
Yeah, they will like take 20%, but you basically come in, you document some income, they estimate, they give you 80% of the estimate, and I don't know, you set up later, but yeah, so it's like a high interest loan, but. So it's and then, the woman at Catherine Eden, who does this sociology at Harvard, she did some qualitative work about kind of the talking along to people about welfare versus the EITC, and they all said the whole welfare thing is incredibly degrading. You have to go in and prove that you don't have enough money, and prove that you're not cheating, and prove that your boyfriend doesn't, all this stuff. And there's the EITC, like, we get a check, we feel like the government's investing in this.
Yeah, well,
You know,
SNAP
backing up.
SNAP is not degrading, Medicaid is not degrading.
Right.
These things are very easily accessible to.
Well, SNAP, you still go through a caseworker, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not, yeah, I mean, welfare looks a lot into your
SNAP, I mean, in
family.
case, I thought it's a pretty easy application, it's a function of some things you do. I
Well, I have a student working on it who's talking about caseworkers, I don't know, I mean, they may not be as meddlesome about where's the mail live and all that kind of stuff.
It is one person one time had to return an item from the grocery store because it couldn't use it with one of the welfare, and I think it was SNAP, like certain things are not covered. So they had to return certain things, and
You do see that when you go, yeah, so now they have, I mean, they used to have, the paper checks, so now they have the EBT, so I can't tell whether it's not so much credit card, and that was fine.
yeah, but they still have to separate things, and something
Yeah.
like mistakes, you have to, but why not just guaranteed income?
But I just what?
Why not just guaranteed income? Like, you seem to claim that we really want to make sure everyone is working.
Well, then, I mean,
Yeah.
guaranteed income, and, I think it's gonna have adverse labor supply effects, I don't know,
Yeah, exactly, but
right.
why is it bad if, for example, stay-at-home parents want to stay at home? Because basically, we're trying to say like, if
No.
I'd rather you hire a nanny, I'd rather have like two people hire each other as the nannies of their kids, because that way they're employed, than just staying with their own kids and taking care of them, right?
Right.
So.
No, I
Just a guaranteed income.
Well, you're talking about child
screw up
tax.
everything now. What?
You're talking about child tax credit, which, there's a
Yeah,
lot,
or
there's a
other
lot of
kinds,
foment.
so basically like not tied to working, like why do we
Right.
want to make sure?
Yeah, but why do we
everyone
want
works
that?
in this-
It seems like totally counterproductive.
Well, it depends, I think
This
it
is the one thing that's worked.
depends on the childcare market, I think it depends on the childcare market, so
Yeah.
if there's not much of a childcare market, then the best, even, I think the problem is,
We're
of
not
course,
having children,
some people are better mothers, some
Guys.
people are worse mothers and better
but
workers.
we're not having children.
Well,
I mean, what is this focus on? We've got a big problem, men not working,
where's that?
and we're focusing on women raising children. I mean, it's the wrong place, men not working.
Men can also raise children.
Okay, but the problem is, it's men who don't have children, or have children not, that they're not taken care of, who are not working, that's the problem. All this other stuff.
A lot of the decline in male employment, some is younger, but the other rising problem that has nothing to do with it, is kind of, 35 to 55-year-olds. I mean, that's sort of this remarkable trend. And it's in kind of the southeastern, the places coal has declined, opioids, that's a new phenomenon that I think people who like me engage in policy are really, I mean, struggling with like, what do you do about this?
Well, how many of them take care of their parents? So I know a guy who has been
Man.
unemployed until his dad passed away. He's 33, I think. He lives with his parents. And he was basically taking care of his father until his father passed away 2 months ago.
You think
And now
that's
he's
the
looking for a
problem?
job.
You think that's the problem?
I don't know, I
Well,
mean,
I think it's right.
there's, I mean,
It's still-
a lot of things have changed, mobility, we know mobility has fallen, right? People use, and how, because the relative house prices, the dispersion's gone up, like you moving to California used to cost you 50% more, now it's, whatever, 700% more. So there's a lot of reasons people are stuck in places without jobs, and I don't know if it's all incentives, partly for sure.
A question for you about, like another thought, really about like, payroll tax deductions, or sorry, payroll tax cuts or negative payroll taxes. As opposed to, this one EITC check that you get once a year in the mail. I really don't believe that annual tax credits actually shift behavior that much. I mean, obviously, there's evidence that you think about like people say, child tax credits somehow incentivizing people to have more children. I'm much a bigger believer in this idea that, if you just instantly wrote a check, like a baby bonus, you paid it to someone as soon as they had the child, that would be a greater incentive to actually move fertility. And I think there's some maybe evidence that that's right, but I think there's just behavioral evidence or empirical medical evidence that you're receiving a check every 2 weeks through either a payroll tax cut or have you, is more likely to change behavior, at least in terms of spending.
But when people had the choice to do that with the ITC, they didn't, which is, I mean, almost no one chose to take it as out of payroll. Right, it used to be until the law changed, whatever it was 5, 6 years ago.
Oh.
You had a choice, 2%, literally 2% of taxpayer of EITC filers took it out of payroll. So I don't know. I mean,
That's one of the
Like,
things.
to get that, you actually have to file the taxes to get the. I guess like, of course, people, if you're filing taxes.
well, the payroll thing you estimate,
You don't
you
want to
estimate
take a
might be
check
bad.
up front, but I guess the point is like, if you had the choice of policy.
Yeah, no, I'm always amazed at all the work on, welfare incentives and this, that, and the other. I mean, and we probably don't appreciate this because, for us, utility maximizing is an assumption. It's not a matter of survival and feeding your kids, right? It's just making more effective use of your money. For them, it is, and I think all the structural modeling of people, modeling these complicated budget constraints and under the, they kind of fit the data pretty well. Like people, I think when you're really thinking about every dollar, you figure this stuff out. And I can't speak from experience. I'm saying that's my impression. I do think it's surprising these models seem to fit so well for all the savings thresholds, all these different rules, these different programs. It seems like we get responses across the board, which suggests that when you really are severely constrained, it's more like the profit maximizing assumption than the utility maximizing assumption.
I just think the Chetty paper, they're teaching the tax code thing, the tax code is just so complicated that even, there have been all these attempts to run EITC RCTs and teaching people, to take the EITC, and I feel like a lot of them haven't had most promising results.
But I thought he also has work that says, playing to sort of these I can't remember where it's published, these network effects, where EITC filing goes up, more people file, and where it goes up among the self-employed, more of the self-employed have income just at that corner on the right, so people, I thought he has some work saying people do seem to learn this partly from others, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I just hit Medicare age. And all my friends are telling me all the rules. Right, and I keep saying, well, actually, because I'm employed and have insurance, I don't have to sign up, there's no penalty, but there's the information flow, I find when people like hit these, Medicare is a big policy, a big deal for people.
Things like unemployment insurance, like half the people who are eligible for unemployment insurance don't even take it out. So it's like there's a weird information. There's some great work by Brennan, who's a Stanford PhD student, that his job might be but it's crazy, just the informational frictions of like how well people actually understand.
Would you take that?
I would.
Personally, I would.
I've never been in a position where
I'm just saying that some of it might be
quietly do it where nobody would know, absolutely.
Would you? I mean, you still
Why wouldn't you do, I mean, I know why you wouldn't do it. Why wouldn't you do it if you were in a
I'm
situation
thinking
that you really
it's
needed
the
money?
same story as when people say that the red states are the poor states and they vote Republican, they're voting against the economic interests. It's the same bullshit. it's, you don't wanna feel good about yourself getting unemployment insurance. You
I
wanna
will tell you,
get a job.
I have two kids with MBAs and both their spouses have MBAs, and you know, some of them, none of them fortunately, but their friends, just go ahead layoffs and. They're all mid-30s, you know, unemployment vacation.
Yeah, that's a different group.
I'm saying, but these are people, a lot of money, they got savings.
You know, I'm
They
saying,
own houses.
think about the red state guy who, you know, was brought up in a world where the world was you worked and you were embarrassed not to. And you don't wanna do that. You know, this idea that somehow, oh, they're idiots.
But they are getting.
You and your employer paid into that unemployment insurance program, I mean.
Right, you have to pay taxes for it. It's like health insurance. Yeah, I don't know.
It's not, it is,
Maybe
it's
a
still
stigma.
different from just straight up welfare.
And also unemployment is often not your fault at all, particularly when you know, and if it is your fault, you're not.
I mean, with my kids,
Right.
you know, we're not, just like this bullshit. You know,
What- what-
with my kids, we're not like, well, I got fired, so I'm gonna go get unemployment.
You start.
They're not stop, they're not going to stop.
You're being patient.
Comment on your findings on the differential impact on.
Yeah.
And then you go,
Well, I have some Schedule C income, but I did not.
You have
file
these
for-
findings on how black and white people are different.
This is one mistake.
I once read that the original proponents of minimum wage back in the very late 1800s, early 1900s, did it because they wanted to have this impact, right?
I think it's a later map. There is a historical, I don't know, it's evidence, certainly, a story that gets
that was a
told,
good one.
that especially with the migratory shortage.
I'm myself, I'm sorry.
You are, again, it's not a little bit, they are worried about competition and.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a place, I think.
And that's why they wanted to have it.
That, yes, I don't know, just like, Ray Marshall wrote about, you know, the early races and the unions, you know, unions were created. Yes, we haven't drawn, yes.
I've heard.
I always, like, I know we're also doing interdisciplinary research, but I always worry when we do, it's harder to figure out, I mean, I've been studying this for 30 years, I don't know everything. So yeah, I can read a couple history books and they'll say this, but you know, like the next one else is like, oh no, you got it all wrong. So we haven't gone into
Also,
that.
if ever, yeah, people will spend, I guess almost $2 billion.
Sorry for having to run. A friend is presenting her job talk.
Thanks, take care.
You can have a lot of, like simple, like,